Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to address you this morning. So, as Jackie said, I'm an anthropologist. I've always been fascinated by the way the social world changes our inner experience. And I'm going to talk about that today by talking about the experience of voices. So let me give you an example. In the winter of 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. was at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. He was scared. There had been death threats against his family. He was contemplating withdrawing, and he sat at his kitchen table and prayed. And as he did so, he heard God say that God would be with him, and he chose to go forward. The experience of hearing a voice is the experience of being spoken to in the absence of a human speaker. And this is our rock star in voice hearing, the young peasant woman, Joan of Arc. However you understand the ultimate cause of the voice, the proximate cause, the experience, is of a thought or some kind of mental event that feels like it's not your own, and that it feels as if what William James called the mineness of your thought, it feels as if that no longer is there, that it's not really your thought. And if it is audible, it feels that it is not inside of you. These experiences are more common in the general population than you'd imagine, although you can see that the way that you ask the question leads to very different rates of the experience. Oops. You probably are most familiar with these experiences in the context of psychosis, because hearing voices is a symptom of many psychiatric illnesses. It is the most common characteristic of our worst psychiatric illness, schizophrenia. Some people have argued that all voices come from a continuum of psychosis, that there is a deficit in which the minus somehow gets decoupled from the experience of the thought. And so this deficit, in people with schizophrenia, there's kind of a dollop of the deficit. But with somebody like Martin Luther King Jr., there's more like a drop. That's not my intuition. I argue that there's something more fundamental about the way that we relate to our minds that gives rise to these experiences. And that psychosis is a sort of special kind of condition that tweaks something much more basic. I began thinking about these experiences in the late 80s when I was spending time with people you might call spiritual but not religious, people who call themselves witches and magicians. I was there as an anthropologist. I thought I was there to study their beliefs and how they came to certain understandings. What I found is that people were much more interested in the fact that they had these cool experiences, vivid experiences of spirit, things that felt that they were supernatural or somehow not available to other people, and that these experiences had something to do with learning. People would say things like, if you want to know magic, you've got to practice. Some people are better at this than others. But that everybody who practices will feel something supernatural or special or kind of different. And so that's kind of been the intellectual rabbit that I've been chasing for the past few decades, these odd experiences. And I've been spending time with religious people who have vivid experiences of spirit, and with people with psychosis who hear voices and have other unusual experiences. My method is both comparative and phenomenological. I think of myself as in the tradition of William James. I sit with people and I talk and I probe carefully, although I try to probe in a way that does not presume psychopathology. As Jackie said, more recently I've been combining that method with the psychological methods of surveys and experiments. Over the last few decades, I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, some of them psychotic, some of them not. And what I want to do this morning is to build a case for a non-mad pathway through which people have these experiences. And I'm going to talk about 3 causal factors. The first is that training really does matter. Some years after I wrote the book on witchcraft, I met a young, blonde Californian evangelical who told me that if I wanted to understand her God, I should sit down for a cup of coffee with him. And that fascinated me so much that I spent years in evangelical churches. And as a point of reference, at the time that I was doing this work, roughly 1 in 4 Americans went to a church like this, where people set out to have an intimate, back and forth relationship with God. The thing that I really noticed about this world is that hearing God speak, that takes learning. So people come to this church and sometimes they say, well, God doesn't talk to me. Would you pray for me? Because I know he talks to you. He doesn't talk to me. They come to a church and the first thing they learn in order to begin to have this experience is that the mind isn't private, but that thoughts and images and sensations one might have understood as self-generated are really God speaking. You have to learn to think about your mind a little differently, as if it's got a permeable boundary between you and God. The new evangelical has to learn to pick out God's thoughts as being different from her own. And here's somebody who's giving me an example of this. When people were praying over me and I'm just receiving it, meaning the prayer, and all of a sudden I hear, go to Kansas, which is where her parents live. Because I was debating whether to go to Kansas, but I hadn't been thinking about it within a 24-hour period. And so people pick out thoughts that feel more spontaneous, thoughts that feel louder, thoughts that feel different, thoughts that seem to be the kind of thing that God should be saying to them. And they tell me that over time those thoughts seem to stand out more. They're more aware of the difference of those kinds of thoughts. She learns to practice talking with God. So when she's doing this, she's in a group, she's kind of focused on her inner experience. And what she's doing as she prays, you could describe as mental imagery cultivation. People are trying to see God as vividly as they possibly can. I've had people tell me that they experience themselves as standing in the throne room, and they try to feel the power of the heat of God's power on their cheeks. I've had people talk about sitting on a park bench with God's arm around their shoulders. People who go for walks with God and try to hear what God is saying to them. People who talk about cuddling with Jesus while sitting in Jesus' lap. And they say that as they do this, their mental images feel sharper and bolder and somehow more real. One woman told me that as she prayed, her inner images were kind of like watching PowerPoint. They also just talk to God as if God is there. It's something that the pastors say. Even if you don't really believe in God, talk to God as if he's present, and soon he will be. And that's what they say. So after some months, people say things like this. I recognize God's voice the way I recognize my mom's voice on the phone. There are hundreds of manuals that you can buy that teach you how to do this practice, how to talk to God. And they all say that God's voice is really not an audible experience. But about a third of the people that I spoke to had some kind of experience, at least once, in which God spoke in a way that had a hearing quality. So here's a woman who said to me, the Lord spoke to me clearly in April, like May or April, to start a school. And because of our conversation, I said, you heard this audibly? Yeah. Were you alone? Yeah, I was just praying. I wasn't praying anything really. I was just thinking about God, and I heard start a school. I immediately got up and was like, okay, Lord, where? You can do this without God. So there's a corner of the internet in which I've been spending time recently, in which people set out to create invisible friends called tulpas. This is explicitly a psychological practice. There are no metaphysical convictions. And there are thousands and thousands of people who try to do this. If you go to the site, you can click on the manuals. And the manuals give you 2 instructions. The first thing you should do is to use your mental imagery and to see your invisible companion as vividly as you possibly can in your mind's eye. And people talk about spending hundreds and thousands of hours looking at their tulpa's nose and looking at the hair and trying to imagine what their voice will sound like. And they also just talk to their tulpa as if their tulpa is there. And just like the evangelicals, they report that over time they begin to have the sense that this invisible being emerges from their thoughts, that it feels different from them, that it feels sentient, that it feels alive. And every so often they have a sensory experience of that tulpa, as if they can hear it with their ears or feel its touch. So that was training. The second factor is absorption. And it turns out some people are indeed better at doing this than others. The absorption scale is a list of 34 items like this, initially drafted as a pen and paper measure of hypnotizability, although most people now think that it picks up something a little closer to getting caught up in your imagination. You give it to somebody and you say, are these statements, is this statement and that statement, is it true for you? This is often treated as a personality trait, as something that individual people have. And one of my robust observations is whether I'm working with evangelical Christians or ordinary Christians or non-Christians or undergraduates who I'm trying to get to experience the presence of Leland Stanford Jr. I've done it. The more truths somebody has marked on the absorption scale, the more they say that the invisible being feels real to them, the more they say they have vivid experiences, and the more they say that they've had an experience of hearing the invisible being's voice. The third factor, the way that you think about thought, really matters. So let me begin by observing that I think all humans everywhere have something like a default model of how thought works, how the mind works. That thoughts are located in the body, that they're private, that they're our thoughts, they're my thoughts, we own them. And while they affect us, they affect the thinker, they don't kind of get loose from the mind and go off and act on their own. But thoughts also feel like power, even to a secular modern audience. And many people have experiences that violate that default model of mind. So we all dream. And sometimes you have a dream that really feels as if it contains information that you didn't know, that came to you from outside. You can feel love. At the level sort of sometimes feels as if it's so big it escapes your body. You get really angry at somebody, even if they're not in the room. If you curse at them, it feels like an action. And we can talk as if poems and songs just kind of come to us unbidden from outside. So even modern secular people have kind of intuitions that it's possible for thoughts to kind of leave the mind and act on their own in the world or enter the mind from outside. And I think that that culturally, some of these intuitions get developed and elaborated into ideas that cursing can really work, that there is divine inspiration, that there are people who have malevolent thoughts, and those thoughts can leave their body to affect somebody else's body. We can describe all of these as porosity, borrowing the term from Charles Taylor. The idea that the mind-world boundary is permeable in non-ordinary ways. So some years ago, I ran a project with a terrific group of young anthropologists and psychologists, and we were interested in the way people thought about thought and whether there was a relationship with their vivid experience of gods and spirits. We worked in 5 parts of the world, and in each domain, people did intense, intimate, open-ended, ethnographic style conversations. They taught research assistants to stand online at the equivalent of the DMV and had them ask short interview questions to people in the general population. And they took surveys and they gave them to undergraduates. And we found this very striking finding, that no matter where we went, no matter how we asked the question, the more porosity an individual attested to, the more they were likely to say that they'd heard a voice, seen a vision, or felt the presence of a God or invisible spirit. And the more absorption they attested to, the more they reported they'd heard a voice, seen a vision, had some other intense and unusual experience of some spiritual being. So to summarize, I've seen 3 factors. There's a story about practice, mental imagery, cultivation, and as-if imagination. A story about an individual proclivity, which I've described as absorption. And a story about some kind of cultural model in which a porous mind is a dimension of the way that people think about thought. All 3 of these facilitate the experience of thought as not one's own and not inside. And so I'm trying to make the argument that there's something like a non-mad pathway, that the attention to inner mental events leads to some mental events seeming to be more external, more in the world real. There's much more to be learned about practice, absorption, and porosity. But let me say just a word about psychosis. And I have to say that I've been approaching psychosis in a similar kind of way. And let me just say quite briefly that I've been looking at people who hear voices, the voices of psychosis, who meet criteria for schizophrenia across the globe. And the headline, not time to discuss in detail, but the headline is that compared to persons with schizophrenia in Chennai in South India, in Accra and Cape Coast in Ghana, in Shanghai, in Chiang Mai in Thailand, in Kazan in Russia, Americans who meet criteria for schizophrenia and hear voices, they have much more violence in their voices, and they hear many more violent commands. It's a very striking observation. The second thing that I think we're beginning to feel confident about is that sometimes the religious expert, in this country and abroad, is somebody who actually does have something like a psychotic process, but is using these practices from religion to kind of rein in and perhaps mitigate the severity of their psychotic symptoms. Let me end on a broader point. This work suggests that it's possible to learn to experience some thoughts as not me and as not inside, and if that humans do so with the intent of experiencing an invisible other, humans can learn to make that invisible other feel real. I'm not opposed to the possibility that there is also a non-human God, but what I want to say clearly is that we have a relationship with our own thoughts, and we can use that relationship to make it feel as if an invisible other is there. I just want to pause to reflect on how remarkable that is. The most moving thing I saw when working with evangelical Christians is that the God who spoke back felt like a social relationship to his humans. I'm not meaning to suggest that religion is always good or helpful, but politics aside, this God gave people advice that was better than their own advice and advice they were more able to follow, and this God made them feel loved and protected. And I'm sure that this social relationship with God is one reason for the striking finding that religious observance is good for your body. So actually, rather than just a sign of madness, voices are also evidence of the human capacity to heal ourselves from within. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanya. That was fantastic. Questions for Tanya? We need, yeah. And please say your name and where you're from.
Gabby Starr, Pomona College. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the hedonic nature of these experiences of this sort of external or internal other. And I ask the question because it's my sense that the reason that we have these capacities to imaginatively manifest something is because sensation actually begins prior to perception, and it tends to begin with a prediction about the world, and then that prediction about the world then helps us to shape the what we actually perceive in the world. And so, in general, we don't notice these kind of moments that precede perception unless there's some disruption that appears between around the perception. Like when you reach for a glass and you think it's wine and it's water and it tastes like nasty watery wine and not like what it actually is. That's a moment where you can perceive that you have your sensation was shaped prior to your actually having it. In general, those moments are imperceptible and really diaphanous. But when we do it on purpose, they see it's easier to do it by imagining something diaphanous than something solid. And that's because in order for the mechanisms to work, they need to be largely imperceptible. So when they separate out, like in the tasting of the nasty wine, it has a hedonic cast to it that's negative. But when you produce these on purpose, they generally have a positive hedonic characteristic to them because there's a successful creation of the imagery. So okay. I'm trying to say, in the psychotic case, right, there's often the negative hedonic component of it. But in the transcendental case, then it has a positive cast because there's success of having reached out to God. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about those differences of hedonic cast in the kinds of extrasensory experiences.
A great question, and you have predictably asked the question at the heart of this that nobody knows the answer to, which is why people actually hear voices. And what I mean by that is that nobody really understands why it is that this thought is felt like a perception and that thought is not. My crew of people definitely think that predictive processing, some kind of expectation of things, of what will happen, lies behind the fact that Christians are more likely to experience God's voice. Witches do not experience the voice of a Christian God. They experience Caridoin. They experience Demeter. But these experiences happen to atheists. They happen to spiritually but not religious people. It's also true that the quality of the experiences for folks with psychosis are quite different from the quality of folks who are religious. So when somebody is psychotic, when they're mad, to use the word that the activists prefer, the experience of hearing voices can happen very frequently, many times an hour. There can be many, many words in the experience. And what is experienced is often mean and disturbing. Not always. People have positive experiences as well. We don't really understand that. Folks who are religious, their experiences their audible experiences are rare. If it's audible, they can remember just a few, just a handful. If it's audible, they have 4 to 6 words, and the content tends to be startling but not surprising. Why is it good for them but bad for these folks? So there's one model that's a sophisticated version of the decoupling of the minus from the thought, which is a theory about the efference quality. The efference copy we make of our thoughts. Some of my best beloved interlocutors think that that's not true, and that instead what you really have is a kind of, a bubbling up of sort of neuronal electrical charge that's interpreted by the brain in different ways. I don't know. I do think that if you are immersed, it is often the case, but not always the case, that when you do not meet criteria for psychosis, the experience is positive. But that's not always true. There's a category of experiences around sleep paralysis in which people Like a quarter of you have had sleep paralysis. You wake up in the middle of the night, you can't move, and it sometimes feels like there's a presence in the room. That's almost always a negative experience, and sometimes sexually ecstatic, not always. Anyway, but I don't quite know the answer to your question.
Thank you. We'll take another.
Yeah, Rich Schifrin from Indiana. My colleague, Beth Loftus, member of APS, gave a talk here several years ago, pointing out that people can learn over some extended period of time to form memories of personal events that never happened. And that they're very confident that these memories are real and, in fact, lead to all kinds of problems as a result that she had to deal with. And I can't help wondering whether the perception of these things that, let's say, the evangelists have are really a different form of exactly the same process of formation of things that never happened.
Great question. And so in the sciencey empirical domain, people will distinguish between psychosis and dissociation. And dissociations, when I teach about this to undergraduates, I say that there's an elephant. I talk about the parable of the 6 blind men around the elephant, and some of them feel a trunk, which is the leg, and some feel the rope, which is the tail, some feel it a snake, which is the trunk. The phenomenon of dissociation, trance, hypnosis, and absorption, that's the elephant. There's some collection of human capacities in which people develop a relationship with what they imagine, and what they imagine can come to feel more and more real to them. A memory is different from a voice, but whatever is going on in the spiritual domain, or the domain in which people do not meet criteria for psychosis, there's something like that. Some capacity to have the experience somehow comes to feel independently real, comes to feel more like a perception. People move around that spectrum. It's one reason why it's so hard to pin down what is a voice. People clearly do have experiences that feel as if they are not their own. So I'm confident of that because I talk to people. I'm also confident because we're actually now putting tulpomancers into fMRI machines, and we find that their brain behaves differently when they hear their tulpa speak. So they're having experiences, but the way that they remember the experience can alter. So another theory is a theory that we quickly monitor what's real. We quickly monitor our thoughts, and the judgment that we bring to bear shifts the kind of phenomenal quality of the thought and makes it more or less inside or outside, so the domain of reality monitoring. And I think that may also be playing a role. But yes, you're correct.
Fascinating. With that, I think we have to go on.
Okay.
Anthony.
All right, we'll take one more question.
Okay, Bob Hauser, Philadelphia. 2 quick questions. You mentioned
course.
hypnosis a few sentences back, and I'm just curious to know whether individuals who are more susceptible to being hypnotized are more likely to experience the kind of phenomena that you've described. And second, completely different question, have you looked or considered the parallel, and I like asking this in front of this audience, with the phenomena that you're talking about and sudden scientific insights?
Yes. In fact, we have a paper that's shortly coming up in the topics on cognitive science that addresses exactly that issue. Yes, I think that if you're susceptible to hypnosis, you're more likely to have these experiences, and that's actually part of a project that we're doing now. It turns out it's not trivial to run many people through a test of hypnotic responsiveness, but we think that that's true. And yes, I think there's something about the way in which both absorption and porosity is something about the willingness to step back from your own mental thinking or somehow have a different relationship with your thought, so that you are able to kind of allow something to run so that it feels as if it is independent for you. So people who write, for example, fiction writers often report that their characters start to feel real and act independently from them and tell them what to write. That's clearly the case with J.K. Rowling. You can't write that quickly otherwise. But I think it's also true. It also has something to do with the creativity of the scientists, like the benzene ring that came to Kekule in a dream. That there's something that you allow some of your thought to actually behave, to play on its own, and then it has a kind of external quality that can teach you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. That was outstanding.